You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 267 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. Today, we're in the Vale of Glamorgan in Wales to meet Lucy George, who turned her family's fruit farm into a commercial tea estate. You may not associate tea with Wales. I certainly didn't until I heard about Lucy. But she is clearly determined to show that it is possible, and I am intrigued to hear her story today. So today we are going to be hearing about Lucy's journey into growing tea, the unique challenges of growing it in Wales, and also about her current Nuffield Scholarship that she's recently started. Lucy, welcome to Meet the Farmers. Let's start with where you are, first of all. So tell us about the Vale of Glamorgan and the farming landscape generally before we talk about tea.
Okay. Obviously, South Wales, we're pretty much very close to the coast here. So as the crow flies about 4 miles away from the Great British Channel. We do have some stunning coastline. The channel's probably not that great, but the coastline's pretty good. Farming wise, I think it's had like a lot of dairy in the past, like a lot of small scale dairy farms. We don't really have much arable around here at all, so it's all quite small scale. But yeah, it was mainly dairy. A lot of that's obviously sort of gone. Sign of the times. There's a few still around, but not very many dairy farms. Fair amount of beef production. There's some lowland sheep, that sort of thing. And there's a sort of growing momentum now for sort of small scale vegetable and, different cultivation. There's some vineyards popping up, a couple of fruit growers, that sort of thing. So,
okay, that's an interesting sort of take on the change then, actually, especially. So would you say there are more smaller scale producers who've sort of either converted into that sort of thing or come into the area?
I think so. I think the sort of what we term as larger farms, which are very small in comparison to elsewhere in the country. But for larger farms around here, they tend to have got a little bit larger. A lot of them are, renting what were neighbouring farmlands and things. But yeah, I think there actually seems to be more interest again now. It sort of went through a period that a lot of people, as you know, were sort of leaving farming. But I think there's increasing momentum now with, food for schools, providing vegetables and fruit. So I think there's, growing awareness and more people sort of starting to look at it as a potential option. But the Vale, we're on the outskirts of Cardiff, so notoriously quite an expensive area. So for new entrants, it's really, really hard around here to even, you couldn't even dream of buying land, to be honest. It's hard. So
yeah. Tell us about your farm before you started growing tea.
It was a meadow field originally, just 5-acre field in this particular site that my mum and dad owned. They started a fruit farm back in 1984. Originally it was just pick your own strawberries and raspberries primarily. And then in the late 80s, my mum started making ice cream using surplus fruit from the farm. So that started getting sort of commercial sales around South Wales primarily. They put up polytunnels in the 90s. There was a sort of development of bringing polytunnels or sort of that type of style over from Spain. So Spanish polytunnels with Haygrove near Ledbury. So Dad invested heavily in those. We took all the fruit out of the ground and it all went into substrate production. So we could get several crops a year.
Okay.
Raspberries were all in substrate. We sort of went sideways into blueberry production, things like that, basically. So it was very intense production, small scale, just 5 acres, but sort of high intensity. So yeah, that was pretty much the backbone of the business.
Okay. And have you been involved in the business from the sort of start of your career, or have you done other things?
Yeah, I think I was running around in a jumpsuit from a pretty early age. So it's sort of, yeah, sort of in drainage ditches and sorting out irrigation parts and things like that. So yeah, all sorts of useful things growing up. It was like sort of, it's a typical family farm, I guess. You know, you were sort of packing fruit before school and that sort of thing. So I guess grown up with sort of it in my blood to some extent. The farm was bigger. There was sort of a lot of additional land, but some of that was rented out for different sort of agriculture. So some was grazed for dairy. That's going back quite a bit now. And the rest was just like for sort of hay meadows, that sort of thing.
So I'm intrigued now. So when and how did the idea to grow tea come from?
In fairness, that was a bit of a random choice. I'd taken over the farm back in 2003. I'd sort of left a job it was quite well paid. I had weekends off, all sorts of cushy things a lot of people take for granted in life.
Yeah.
And yeah, came back and took over the farm basically. So that was back in 2003, and I did a very sort of familiar, well-trodden path of following footsteps, I guess, of what the farm already was. So it was very much continuing in fruit production, ice cream production, built a farm shop. So it was, yeah, a lot going on. It was quite a big business. I think it was literally just one day waking up, realizing I wasn't happy doing what I was doing.
Okay.
Way too many staff, too much going on for one person to really be running single-handedly, and pretty much shut the whole thing down. So that very, very small scale, I could just sort of function here on my own, basically. Yeah, it was a complete withdrawal from life in general. For me, it's what I needed at the time. But I guess I was left with a lot of infrastructure, so irrigation, polytunnels, and no real purpose for them. And at the same time, I'd had that experience of growing all sorts of different crops, firstly for commercial fruit, but also for the farm shop. So we did sort of salads, vegetables, so I had a good idea of what brought in what. We used to grow grapes on contract as well for a local vineyard. So we'd kind of gone down that route.
Yeah.
So again, it was just sort of looking at what I could do using the tunnels and the irrigation. And tea was a completely random call, to be fair. It was very random. Yeah, I didn't even know, besides getting tea bags from the local supermarket, I didn't know a lot about tea.
I think that's, just pausing on that part of the story, I think it's a great thing to reflect on, actually, that often, and I mean, sometimes the business that you inherit, that you take on, whether that is a business that you buy, a farm that you buy, whether it's someone has been renting some land before and they had a business model which you take on, or similarly through a family business, you're next in line. It's so often the case, isn't it, that actually what there is before, it can sometimes constrict ourselves in terms of what we really want to do, and actually how you shape it and take it on. It's a big thing to sort of to shift in your mind, isn't it? But once you have that experience and you undertake it, I think it's an even bigger decision, actually, and a brave decision as well, to actually take a stand and say, you know what, I'm going to make a change and then make it work.
Yeah, I think, you're definitely right on that. I think it's something that's probably commonly experienced within the farming industry, especially if something's handed down over generations. It's sort of, I think I came into the business thinking, right, I want to put my own stamp on it. I expanded the fruit and the ice cream and built the shop, which I was sort of in my own head, I was like, ooh, it's all different things. But it kind of wasn't. It was pretty much what had been there before. It was just sort of making it sort of, I guess, bigger and sort of I think chasing that. The whole ethos of what I had was very much sort of chasing margins, profitability, volume production, scaling, sort of looking at what competitors were doing, what's new ice cream brand on the market, what are they doing? And that was pretty much the whole approach. And to some extent, it's what I'd been taught as well. It's what I'd grown up with. And it's what I'd even done at university. It's that sort of more or less sort of competitive mindset towards the farm and business in general. So yeah, I think it was a natural step to take on what was here before and just run with it to some extent.
Let's turn towards tea. So you've got this idea. How do you start? How does it become reality?
It literally I think I thought about tea, didn't know where it even grew or really came from. That was how naive I was back then. And yeah, went home, hit Google, looked it up to really just try and find out more about it. I saw it was being grown in Cornwall at a estate called Tregothnam, and there was a lady called Susie Monroe Walker who'd taken some cuttings from there up to Scotland. So that was pretty much all I needed to be like, right, okay, there's potential here. I haven't got a clue about camellias or how to grow tea or even really what it is, but that's all I needed. It kind of inspired a deep dive research from that point, really. And I guess that's how it started, was just obsessive research into growing conditions and how to get it off the ground.
Yeah. I mean, if we turn to challenges, I mean, I'm guessing your biggest challenge must be climate and weather.
Yeah, pretty much. That wraps it up quite succinctly. Yeah, climate. I think so. I think it's primarily one of the reasons that it hasn't really been grown much in the UK up to sort of recent times, because of the climate is very, very marginal for tea production. So generally we can produce good tea, but in much smaller volumes than you'd get near equatorial regions, basically. So that's one of the primary reasons, but also just plant survival rates tend to be quite low in the UK. A lot of different varietals has been brought into the UK, and a lot of those just aren't suitable for the conditions here. So part of the problem is establishing plants that survive in the climate.
Okay. How do you overcome that? Is it varieties? Is it the way you grow it?
Yeah, so most teas in the world is grown using clones. So tea research institutes all over the world sort of develop certain varietals that suit particular conditions given that country or locality. So certain areas of China, for instance, will have certain tea cultivars that are grown for specific characteristics, whether it's the tea they're making. If they want to make a specific green, they'll be looking for a tea plant that produces leaf suitable for that tea production, basically. It also means if you've got a clone plant, it all crops uniformly at an expected time. So you've got growth, you can then adjust labour requirements, forecast labour requirements. To some extent, a lot of them mitigate local climate situations. So, different climates have different varietals that tolerate different extremes of climate. It also means when you come to process the tea, if you've got every leaf is virtually identical, it means that tea processing, you have your parameters, and it's a lot easier to sort of make a consistent product, basically. The great product homogenization that we're used to now in the world. Yeah. So it ticks a lot of boxes. The other way of growing tea is actually from seed. So tea seed is genetically diverse. So every single seed that even one plant will throw is genetically different. And so because of that, you've got an enormous range of genetics just from one tea plant. So by bringing tea seed into the UK and by growing plants from seed, you've got, to some extent, a much wider capacity for some of those genetics to be suitable for these conditions. So whereas if we'd bought a clonal plant in, the likelihood is that clone may not have liked it here, may not have tolerated the conditions, and would have lost the whole lot. That was a big chance for that to happen. And obviously clones are quite expensive to purchase in the first place. So by buying seed, very cheap, it's a good way to get into the industry. At the time, I didn't have much funding behind me. I still don't. I don't know why I've just said at the time. I still don't. But
then.
Yeah, exactly. Continuing on. It was just, I don't have a lot of finance behind me basically for the farm. So it was a question of finding a way in. So by growing from seed, it's cheap to source, and it gave me a huge genetic bank basically. The idea being that it became a sort of game of numbers. So we brought a lot of seed in. We lost a lot of plants, but some survived. And it's from those plants then that sort of we're now 2 or 3 generations on, and we're cropping our own seed, and we're sort of always improving on the genetics. So we've got plants that are much more tolerant to the Welsh conditions.
Amazing. What impacts the flavour of the tea?
There's so many things. I don't even know where to start, to be honest, with that question. Everything from sort of soil, so many different elements of the soil. So you've got, mineral availability, biomass, fungal bacterial balance, underlying bedrock. Tea plants are really deep rooting. So there's so many issues just from the soil. And then obviously you've got climatic, whether it's rainfall, sunlight, UV light levels is a big influence. In the UK is UV light, obviously heat, wind, and then it goes right through to how you're planting techniques, how you're growing them, how you're actually picking the leaf, and then how you're processing it, and climate while you're processing it. So, yeah, I couldn't ever stop giving you reasons for why a flavour might be impacted. Yeah.
Okay. So season by season, can you taste significant differences depending on the year?
Yeah. For a start, as a tea plant matures and the plant sort of basically gets older, and also its roots spread deeper into the soil, further out, reaching into the soil, it's able to uptake a different profile from the soil, basically, different nutrient profile availability. So there's always going to be that change for the plant itself as it matures until it reaches like a certain point. I think it will always continue to develop, but certainly within the sort of first 5-6 years, there's more rapid change from season to season, year to year, but also within the season. So tea we produce in May is very different to tea we produce in September. It tastes very, very different.
That's really interesting. So, but I'm guessing, so on an individual producer level, so we're talking a different story, aren't we, to when if we think of the tea industry as a whole, where I'm guessing they're looking for more uniformity?
Yep. The tea industry, obviously, we're all used to going and buying sort of well-known brands of tea bags from supermarkets, and we always expect them to taste the same. And that's part of the skill of what they're producing is very talented tea blenders and buyers tasting all these teas and blending them together to always replicate and get that consistency of product. Seed grown, very, very difficult. So yeah, it's a completely different cup of tea, basically. If sort of a lot of people say if you actually drink a seed grown tea alongside one grown from clone, you can actually tell the difference because there's a lot more sort of there's just different nuances to the flavor basically in the cup. It's something that a lot of places actually now in Japan, China, different areas of the world are actually starting to put seed grown plants back in because they're realizing the value in having that sort of genetic diversity to mitigate climate issues, but also because it lets them develop slightly different teas. They're just, they've just got different character profiles, basically.
Hello, listeners. I'm just pausing the podcast for a few minutes to tell you about the Land Alive conference that I'll be heading to next month on the 22nd and 23rd of November at the Bath and West Showground. I recently caught up with one of the co-founders of the event, Graham Harvey, who you might recognise as a former agricultural editor of The Archers, among other things. This week, I wanted to find out why Graham wanted to start Land Alive.
Well, I started Land Alive with my colleague on Sustainable Food Somerset, Stuart Crocker, and we'd been running this annual food trail, which has done very well, which is bringing together regenerative farmers in Somerset with their local communities, hoping to build them a bigger local market. After one of these last year, we suddenly had this idea that we should do a conference. I don't know why. I said, I do have a history of starting conference. I many years ago, I was one of the founders of a conference which has done very well. That's the Oxford Real Farming Conference. It was originally my idea. I met it with Colin Tudge and Ruth West, and we'd been talking, we'd been speaking at a border town. I can't remember which one it was, on the Welsh borders. And it was a transition audience. That's right. We'd been talking about sustainable agriculture. And when the three of us ended up back at this late night Italian restaurant, and we thought, well, we've got a reasonable crowd there, but we're not breaking through with these ideas about changing farming. And I said quite innocently, why don't we start an alternative Oxford farming conference? Oxford was the big establishment farming conference. And so we thought we'd start a renegade conference. So that was my first try at conference. It's done very well. And so we'll see if we can do something similar in the Southwest, which is where I live now.
To buy tickets for Land Alive, simply visit landalive.co.uk. I put a link in the show notes at landalive.co.uk. Let's turn to market. I'm intrigued. Are you aiming this tea at a local market? Are you selling a sort of online? Where's the market for Welsh tea?
When we started sort of really having tea to sell, it was 4 years ago. So it took us quite a few years to actually get to the point of having sort of any realistic production beyond just a few grams. So 2020 was pretty much our first year to market. It's really just developed from there, and it's been a sort of natural development of market for us. So we sell mainly off our own website, but also through selected independent retail. Some gets exported. So ironically, we have some tea going to Japan, Taiwan, China, America. It's something that we actually restrict what we release each year to market, which is a way for us to really control the price point and also the quality of what we're releasing. So we only ever we pitch at the beginning of the year how much we think we're going to produce, and that's what we're going to release that year for loose leaf tea sales. So it's a model that works quite well for us.
And I think I read somewhere, actually, this is a complete aside, but do the Welsh drink more tea than other parts of the UK?
I don't know. I hope they do, but yeah.
I'm sure I read that somewhere in research for this episode.
It's interesting. Well, I'll be going home and to look that one up for sure. So yeah, I don't know. You've got me on that one.
Take me through your Nuffield scholarship, the application and why you wanted to apply.
I think one of the sort of first questions I had with Nuffield was a statement saying that they had a lot of people who applied who all wished that they'd applied a lot earlier in their life rather than leaving it to the point they did. I neatly fell into that box. I wish I'd applied years beforehand. But saying that, I wasn't doing what I am now years ago. So it would have been a very different Nuffield scholarship, basically. And I think to some extent it was beneficial to some extent, me to wait to do the Nuffield, because it's just given me more experience within the industry I'm now in, basically. And I think it's the sort of industry that just is evolving so fast that, and my learning has evolved so fast with it that it's actually been quite good to wait to some extent, because it's actually makes it sort of more defined and more purposeful.
What are the focus areas, I suppose, that you want to explore?
Well, I'm looking very much at sort of agroecology aspects of tea cultivation. So looking at that both from an ecological perspective, so very much from growing side of things, really just ways that we can grow tea. So the way we're growing here is fairly unique in the world, pretty much. We're pushing boundaries a little bit as to how tea is being produced. So we're using polytunnels a lot for tea production, but we're also combining tea with cropping alongside other fruit crops, really so that we have additional income, but also to enhance biodiversity. So it's a full-on sort of agroforestry system that we've got going now. And for me, it's very much trying to develop that alongside, what other crops can be grown with the tea, and how can tea actually benefit other farms and other social community groups, social schemes, that sort of thing. I'm very much sort of passionate that I think tea can be included in agroforestry developments for farms. And I just think it's a really untapped product. There's a lot of potential for it in the UK and Europe. So that's the sort of ecological side, but also looking at it from a social perspective. So tea just on its own merit is a product that brings people together. Everyone's always like, sit down for a cup of tea. It's like a sort of standard phrase. And I think it's very much a product that has totally changed the entire farm here and my own thinking, basically. Whereas I think I said before, the farm was very much a sort of, I guess, traditionally focused on profitability and growth and competitors, what's happening where. Now I see it very much more as a sort of collaboration with other businesses and just people in general. So it's very much, we're going down the route of opening the farm up so that people can come to the farm, experience farm life, basically, from a position that we have a product that people can actually just get hands on. They can pick the tea, it's tactile, they can process the tea, they can see it going through different stages, and then they get to drink the product at the end of the day. And that's kind of quite special.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, because it sort of reminds me almost of wine tourism. That a lot of vineyards, actually, the tourism element is almost as important as the crop itself.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is something that it's very much got the potential to add that element to farms. People can have tourism around tea. People, can go and literally just see it and have a tasting. That sort of side, very similar to, like you said, to vineyards. There's also the ability to be interactive. So, people can do everything with tea, whether it's from planting young plants right the way through from picking seeds, picking flowers, picking the leaf, processing it. They can have a sort of hand in every stage of that development. And to be able to pick leaf in the morning and go home in the afternoon with tea to take home to brew is quite special, because I don't think there's many products that you can actually do that with and that, people can be involved with to that extent. I just think there's enormous potential there for tea to really be that sort of social sort of link, basically, for people to experience on farms, or, like I said, for social groups to grow tea and use tea either as just a product to enjoy themselves or to sell to raise money, for the enterprise, basically.
Just going back to your points about agroforestry, actually, I'm interested there in terms of, do you see potentially then the future of tea production in the UK, say, as potentially being more down that agroforestry, alley cropping, intercropping sort of route?
I think so. Tea itself originates from sort of forested areas, basically. It's sort of natural plant for the very outskirts of woodland forested areas. So it's in its home environment. Now, in the UK, obviously, if you plant it in a woodland with a lot of shade, you've already got a lot of sort of diminishing UV light at this latitude. So it is an element in that you will have a lot less yield. At the same time, your actual leaf flavour is good because of that stress, because of the light diminishment, basically. But certainly, I think for the edges of agroforestry areas, there's a lot of potential. I guess it depends on sort of the model people are running. Like if they were planting a woodland, then there's no reason why you can't have tea on the outside of that woodland. Or if you've got light dappled shade, they can certainly be quite at home in that. But no, certainly I think for a sort of standard row agroforestry system, it would work pretty well.
Interesting. Got we're early days of planning an agroforestry series with the Forestry Commission at the moment, and I'm going to introduce this as an idea, but I'm pretty sure that tea does not feature on any of their lists yet.
It probably doesn't. This is the thing; it's been sort of overlooked, and yet it's an amazing plant. It's, it's an evergreen plant. It can be as big or as small as you want because it takes heavy pruning. So, we keep the bushes quite small so that we have a lot of picking shoots, basically. But you can let them grow quite big. They'll easily grow sort of 3-4 meters. They're sort of like large shrubs, small trees, if left to their own devices. Amazing habitat for wildlife, biodiversity in general. And of course, it's not just tea. You can sell the flowers, the leaf, or rather use the flowers, the leaf, the seed. And obviously from that, you've got different uses as well. So not just beverages or culinary, but you've also got cosmetic use, incorporation into all sorts of other different products. So yeah, there's a lot of untapped potential there.
Yeah, fascinating. Where do you see all this going? Where do you see the future of tea, I suppose, for you, but where do you want to take the business?
Cool. Well, asked me 10 years ago, and I was like, right, I want about 15 acres, and I want to sort of do, quite high volumes. I think back then, the sort of forecast, we actually employed a consultant at the time as well. I think I should be floating around the Med on a private yacht and have weekends off and all sorts of luxury things by now. It hasn't quite worked out like that. And I'm certainly not promising that to anyone because that's just, it's not going to happen. Being slightly more realistic about tea in the UK now. For me, it's like my views have changed entirely. So rather than aiming for sort of like big, it's very much aiming small. So we're literally just heading for 5 acres of tea, but keeping it very small, niche, high quality, specialized production, really just keeping that passion and enjoyment to it rather than worrying about being big. It's also for me incorporating that therapeutic element. So having people able to come and enjoy the farm as much as I enjoy it day to day, and really being able to spend time here from that perspective. We're using tea, so all the tea we don't release for whole leaf sale, we make kombucha.
Okay.
So I see that side of the business actually expanding because for us it provides a sort of full cycle for the farm. So all the spent leaf gets composted, we've got big worm bins, and it all gets put back through and forms fertilizer for the tea. So we're trying to build up a sort of circular system with the farm. We're pretty much there already, I think, but there's always improvements to be made. But I think tea in general, I work with a European tea growers group. So we had about 30 odd tea growers from across Europe come a couple of weeks ago. And that's very much sort of trying to develop tea as an industry within Europe and really to try and gain consumer recognition that you can source tea more sustainably that's locally grown rather than it being sort of shipped across the world, basically. So I'm not saying we'll ever compete or sort of be in a position to replace tea from India, China, but we can certainly provide a very different option there, very similar to how the wine industry's gone. So,
really fascinating, honestly. We're going to round up in a bit, but no, thank you mostly just for certainly opening my eyes to tea in Europe, certainly tea in the UK and Wales, but also the potential for it. And I hope it's given listeners just a different way of viewing things and increase their perspective. So thank you. Where can listeners go to find out more about what you do?
Well, I guess online. It's we've done we've been lucky enough, we've been on a few television programs, and there's a few bits about us online, our own website. There's also a lot of resources online for European tea now, European Tea Growers Group. UK Tea Academy is quite a good one to look at as well for sort of more intensive training on tea, if anyone is interested in different aspects. People interested in buying seed, then there's a few people now selling seed in the UK that are producing seed, ourselves included, but it's something to note that tea seed doesn't stay viable for very long. So if you're looking to buy seed, you really need to buy it in the autumn up to about Christmas, January time. And then after that, don't bother.
Perfect timing then.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect timing. But yeah, and you can also get sort of tea plants. They're more widely available than they ever were now. But again, it's remembering that it's a numbers game, and if you're buying tea plants grown from clones, then you're sort of taking the chance as to whether it's going to like your particular garden. And it might grow well for you, but your neighbours literally next door might struggle with it. So that's how sort of particular it can be. I'd probably recommend seed growing to start.
Yeah, I was going to say, listeners, if you take anything from this episode and you are interested in even just growing some tea, I suppose, I think that's probably a big piece of advice to take. Lucy, we're going to move across to the final questions that I ask everyone when they come on the show. The first is, if you had a message for the public, any message about anything at all, what would it be?
Drink more tea. I would go, we'll just leave it as simple as that. Yeah.
And your message for farmers?
Consider growing tea so people can drink more tea. But yeah, I think, it's very much probably collaboration if it had to be summed up in one word. Yeah, I think that's far more important than what many of us give consideration to. So, yeah.
Yep, it's a word that comes up again and again on the show. And it's an important thing to underline. We will leave it there. Lucy George, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Bends in your ear about tea. Yeah.
It's been great. So yeah, that's it for today. A huge thanks to my guest, Lucy George, for coming on the show. Thank you also for listening. Next time, we'll be in Norfolk with the farm manager of the Crown Point estate, Michael Bulls. But for now, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers, and thank you very much for listening. Meet the Farmers is brought to you by RuralPod Media, the only podcast production agency to specialise in the rural sector. We're on a mission to make rural stories mainstream and help businesses, organisations and communities like you tell your story through podcasting. Podcasting is a fantastic way of connecting with your audience, whoever that might be, getting your message out there and networking with leaders in your niche. RuralPod Media can help you by launching your new podcast or helping you with the technical side. We also provide podcast training and an audit service if you already have a podcast. You're not sure where to take it to next. For more information or to book a call, visit ruralpodmedia.co.uk. That's ruralpodmedia.co.uk.